Early in February 1846, a merchant ship, the Brooklyn, carrying over 200 Mormons, set sail from New York City. Its destination, California. In charge of the company was a 27-year-old elder, possessed of an extraordinary ability to organize and lead. He was energetic, intelligent, and in his heart carried a vision for the destiny of the saints, Samuel Brannon. Samuel Brannon was living in Plainsville, Ohio, a small town near Kirtland, when he first heard the gospel preached by two enthusiastic Mormon missionaries, Orson Hyde and Heber C. Kimball. Soon afterward, he was baptized. Sam was now 14 years of age. He paid his tithing, aided in building the Kirtland Temple, and was convinced that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God. 4 years later, financial disaster shook the area. Sam lost a great deal of money, most of his inheritance. He became inactive in the church and left the Kirtland area to work as a journeyman printer. Eventually, making his peace with the church, he served a part-time mission. Later, with William Smith, a brother of the prophet Joseph, he turned his printing skill toward publishing a little paper for the church in New York known as The Prophet. Soon, tragedy struck. A mob in Carthage, Illinois, murdered the prophet Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram. With the martyrdom, new leadership was needed to guide the church. There were several who felt they should succeed the prophet. During the struggle for leadership, Sam Brannon's sympathies were with William Smith. Wasn't he in line for the presidency? Samuel published several articles with William Smith to convince the saints in the eastern states that William should be the next prophet and that Brigham Young was a usurper. As soon as the leadership of the church in Nauvoo was aware of what the two had published, they promptly disfellowshipped both Brannon and Smith. The prophet's brother refused to yield his position, but Sam, apparently penitent, traveled to Nauvoo and begged forgiveness. He was reinstated in the church and was soon back in New York, helping to publish another church periodical, the New York Messenger, first under the direction of Parley P. Pratt and later Parley's brother Orson. Meanwhile, persecution of the saints was mounting. Orson Pratt issued a proclamation advising all saints in the East to flee for their lives, to go west by land or sea. To those who wished to sail, Elder Pratt said,
Elder Samuel Brannon has been counseled to go by sea. He will sail about the middle of January. Those who wish to accompany him are requested to give him their names as early as possible.
Brannon took his responsibility seriously as he organized and outfitted the expedition. He located a vessel and had carpenters make it more suitable for the voyage. In the hold was an astonishing variety of supplies: books, tools, a printing press, sewing machines, saddles, even 2 milk cows, some pigs, and crates of fowl. Believing that California was to be the gathering place of the saints, Sam Brannon loaded in enough farming equipment for 800 men. 239 passengers signed up, 70 men, 69 women, and 100 children. The fare was $75 a head, half price for children over 5 and under 14. Children under 5 went free. The Postmaster General threatened government interference in the Saints movement west. He offered amnesty at a price. A document drawn up between the A.G. Benson, Kendall and Company and the Latter-day Saints promised the Saints protection if they would deed to the company half of the land they settled. Later, when the Council of 12 saw the document, they rejected it, even though Brannon had already signed. The ship Brooklyn set sail from New York on February 4th, 1846. Coincidentally, that was the very day the Nauvoo Saints, led by Brigham Young, began their journey to the west. The Brooklyn was to take the New York Saints around Cape Horn at the tip of South America to the Sandwich Islands, now called the Hawaiian Islands, and then on to California. 239 passengers were cramped into quarters barely high enough for a child to stand erect. 239 passengers, elbow to elbow for 6 endless months, shared the foul odor, the sickness, the scurvy. Sam chose the most spacious stateroom, and after the first few days, he moved from the Mormon eating area to the captain's table. Right from the beginning, the handsome, meticulously dressed Brannon established his leadership, demanding instant obedience from his band of pilgrims. He introduced the saints to a code of conduct and an organization called Samuel Brannon and Company. All were to unite into one company and together pay the debt for transportation and make preparations for the saints who would come to California. In the company, they would be required to pool the proceeds of their labor over the next 3 years. If anybody refused to obey those terms, they'd be expelled. If the elders departed from the covenants, the common fund was to revert to the first elder, Samuel Brannon. Brannon demanded strict religious devotion. Prayers were held every evening. Attendance was obligatory. He exhorted his pilgrims to a true sense of duty. And God was with these travelers. 4 days out, a devastating storm hit the little vessel. The captain, certain the ship would go down, went below to inform the saints to prepare for the worst. He found them singing hymns, calm and confident in the protection of the Lord. By the end of April, their food and water had almost run out. Scurvy was a scourge to nearly all on board. A storm drove them back from Valparaiso, Chile, where they had planned to purchase provisions. On May 4th, they were able to land 500 miles west of Chile on the small island of Juan Fernandez, interestingly the setting for Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. Here, they received fresh water, fruit, food, and firewood from the 2 families living there, all at no cost. There, they buried Sister Laura Goodwin, the last of 9 people to die on the voyage. The other 8, among them infants and children, had been wrapped in canvas and committed to the sea. While there was death, there was also life. 2 children were born during the voyage. They were named John Atlantic Burr and Georgiana Pacific Robbins, after their places of birth. Toward the end of June, the weary travelers dropped anchor at the Sandwich Islands, now Hawaii. Here, Brannon told the saints to be careful in preaching the gospel to the natives. If anyone should ask what religion they taught, they were to reply that it was to mind one's own business. However, the saints mingled freely with the friendly natives, and Brannon did preach publicly and gave interviews to the press. During the stopover in the islands, Brannon began to buy up firearms and drill the men in warfare. He had heard that the United States was at war with Mexico, and he hoped to take into San Francisco an army to capture the Mexican garrison at Yerba Buena. Far graver problems beset Sam Brannon as they left Hawaii. There was grumbling among his flock concerning his privileges, fancy living, and high-handed tactics. In a shipboard trial which followed, 4 brethren were excommunicated. Instead of silencing protests, this served to fan the rebellion. At last, Yerba Buena, the future city of San Francisco, appeared on the horizon. The American flag waving in the harbor indicated that the war with Mexico had been won. After 6 long months cramped in the hold of a stinking ship, how glad the saints must have been to set both feet on American soil and establish the Church of Jesus Christ in California. Of that journey, one pioneer woman wrote in her journal,
"Of all the memories of my life, not one is so bitter as that dreary 6 months voyage on an emigrant ship around the Horn."
At first, a few of the saints lived in old Spanish adobe barracks or in tents nearby. Others found quarters at the deserted Mission Dolores. Soon after they arrived, they apportioned out parcels of land, and the farming and house building began. Brannon, with Mormon labor, built the nicest home in town. Here, his high society wife gave many parties to which the other Mormons were not invited. Once the saints were settled in their homes, Sam turned his thoughts to a gathering place for the saints coming overland from Nauvoo. In a valley adjoining the San Joaquin River, at a point 80 miles east of Yerba Buena, he found the perfect site. Fertile, teeming with game, and situated on a natural waterway. He called it New Hope. The settlement should have flourished, but instead it failed miserably. The brethren who had been sent there to till the land were torn apart by greed, dissension, and mistrust. At Yerba Buena, apostasy and excommunications were also making inroads in the congregation. They became lukewarm toward the gospel, as interpreted by Sam Brannon. Sam worried about the spiritual sickness of his colony and wrote many letters to President Young asking for advice. But Sam's biggest worry was the main body of the saints. Why would they want to settle in an Indian-infested, alkali dust bowl instead of coming to the lush valleys of California? Brannon determined to speak to the prophet face to face. He was sure he could convince Brigham Young that the Great Basin was not the right place. He and 2 companions made their way over the rugged Sierra Nevadas and across the treacherous desert country of Nevada and Utah. The encounter with Brigham Young took place July 2nd near the Green River in present-day Wyoming. Wouldn't the saints continue on to California? Brannon pleaded and argued eloquently. But Brigham remained resolute. His people would settle in the Great Basin, of which he would later say,
"We have been thrown like a stone from a sling. We have lodged in this goodly place just where the Lord wants his people to gather."
Sam Brannon traveled with the saints into the Salt Lake Valley, sad and bitter. He soon turned back to his beloved California. His farewell to Zion proved to be a final one. Once in California, he threw himself into building up cities such as San Francisco and Sacramento, and in the process made a fortune. In these years, he had the Midas touch. Nearly all his business endeavors turned into gold. Unfortunately, it seemed that some of the capital he invested came from the tithes of the California saints. As branch president, he was still collecting tithing money. The San Francisco Brethren complained about that, as well as the mismanagement of Brannon and Company, the so-called United Order adopted aboard the ship Brooklyn. So most of the holdings were sold and the cash divided among the faithful. That which Brannon couldn't sell eventually wound up as his personal property. What about the tithing that the members of the church had paid him? It never reached Salt Lake City. In 1849, Brigham Young sent a letter asking for the tithes and additional donations. Instead of sending the money, Brannon cut all ties with the church. But he must have been haunted by the advice in Brigham's letter.
"Now, Brother Brannon, if you deal justly with your fellows and deal out with a liberal heart, the Lord is willing you should accumulate the rich treasures of the earth. But should you withhold, your hopes and pleasing prospects will be blasted in an hour you think not of, and no arm to save."
2 years later, when Parley P. Pratt came out to reorganize the church in California, Sam was officially disfellowshipped, not for stealing tithes, nor for his avowed apostasy, but because of his questionable conduct as leader of a vigilante committee formed in 1851 to stem the lawlessness which was plaguing the city. But Sam felt he didn't need the church. He had acquired a sizable fortune and was a leading citizen. He erected hotels and buildings in San Francisco and Sacramento, operated a chain of stores, began shipping operations, purchased a 3,000-acre spread in the Napa Valley on which he built a spa, planted vineyards, and built a winery. He became California's first millionaire. With his vast fortune and influence, he accomplished much. He built railways, organized a militia, and supported troops to drive Napoleon out of Mexico. Brannon's style of living had become opulent and bawdy. At times, he turned to drinking and gambling. Then, his luck began to change. Brannon's wife left him and took his children to Europe. Eventually, she demanded a divorce and half his fortune in cash. That divorce settlement marked the beginning of financial ruin for Samuel Brannon. Through forced liquidation of his assets, his fortune shrank. Sam Brannon ended his days a broken, penniless old man. He died virtually alone, his only companion a boarding house keeper. His body stayed in a receiving vault unclaimed for over a year. When he finally was buried, his only marker was a plain cedar stake. A quarter of a century later, the son of a friend purchased a headstone. California pioneer, dreamer, leader, empire builder. In justice to Brannon's memory, let it be said there existed in the man a certain true measure of greatness. Aside from his betrayal of the church and his insatiable pursuit of wealth, he served California well and ranks among the greats of that state. The saints whom he brought also contributed to the settling of California. The arrival of the Brooklyn made San Francisco largely a Mormon town. Religious services were immediately instituted, and the first school established was taught by Mormon women for Mormon children. Many established businesses and cleared land for farming to further settle this vast, beautiful land of California. Of that original small group of 239 pilgrims who came by ship to the west, many traveled on to the valleys of the Great Basin to settle there with their fellow saints. Some, however, chose to build their Zion in California. The voyage of the Brooklyn was perhaps one of the longest voyages of religious pilgrims ever undertaken, 24,000 miles. It was a great test of faith to the participants. For those pilgrims who followed the counsel of church leaders in Utah and who were guided in their lives by the principles of the gospel, happiness was their reward, whether they were in California or in Utah. But for those who could not follow the brethren and who allowed pride, greed, and worldly ambition to canker their souls, only turmoil and sadness could be their destiny.